Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for the West Coast. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today at what I believe is a very exciting and important webinar about a very untapped and powerful resource that can bring around greater health and social justice in our communities across the country. I wanted to first I am David Chavis, Principal Associate and CEO of Community Science. I am joined here today with Rianna Grissom, our Senior Analyst from Community Science, who has been pivotal in the success of this work. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to take care of some housekeeping matters. If you have, first of all, we will be recording this, as you know, and that we will also be sending out afterwards the report, the full report, as well as the slide presentation to everyone who is registered for this webinar. So let me first talk about some of the key takeaways of this webinar. And why that, I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, is that in 1984, I joined Citizens Committee for New York City and was posed with the challenge of New York is seen as the penultimate welfare state. Everything is going to collapse. The economy is going to collapse. We need to do something to be able to engage New Yorkers in co-producing safety, sanitation, and beginning to deal with the many issues that were growing in those times. We were set out with a task with 2 field staff, some other fundraising and other staff, a whole staff of less than 20 people, to take on New York City and the 32,000 residential blocks at the time. And how do you begin to organize them? And what we saw over those years, depending on who you talk to the growth of 4,000 to 7,000 block and neighborhood associations over the next several years that began to take on some amazing things and facing challenges on their block, in their neighborhood, and eventually issues of transportation and other citywide issues, including the institution of community policing in New York City. So with that, this webinar is here today to talk about the potential of an overlooked great source of power influence that French sociologist de Tocqueville noted was so American and so unique to this country. And even today, as we look, people from around the country, from around the world, come to the United States and by nature of our culture begin to form different kinds of mutual aid, support, and self-help groups. It is so much a part of our American culture, and that it crosses the different cultures, and yet these days we overlook it during these national crises. And so today's takeaways are really focused on what can we do about that? How can we greater engage these groups around the country and provide support to those organizations that are supporting them and making all these day-to-day grassroots changes possible. So today's takeaway is for grassroots and intermediary organizations responded to the community needs in 2020 as they have in 2021 as they have for a long time. And that they are there and they've been out there and they're often the first responders to these things. And that there are ways to strengthen these groups, to get them to create more of these groups, to make them stronger and help them sustain themselves. Today's agenda will be following these introductions. That I'm going to turn over to Rianna Grissom, who's going to talk about the context of these studies that we conducted with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And of course, I have to mention that the opinions expressed today are not necessarily those of the foundation, but clearly ours. We'll also be moving on to talking about some of the findings. Rianna will be talking about the findings from grassroots groups in lower income communities of color, while our study talks about all groups across the country. We're going to focus today on low income communities of color, take some questions that we're going to pose to our panelists, and then discuss findings about intermediary organizations. Intermediary organizations are those groups that provide training and other types of support to these neighborhood, block, civic, and mutual aid associations. And finally, we'll have some more questions for our panelists, and then finally, recommendations that we're making for activating grassroots power, and then we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for all of you to ask your questions. And Dante will reappear for us in order to be able to bring some of those questions to the table. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, Ariana Beedie is an Indianapolis writer, community connector, curator, and facilitator. Currently serving as Neighborhood Engagement Director at Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center. Ari is able to do what she does best, connect with the community. She currently manages multiple grant programs, curates the Neighborhood Resource Center's marketing efforts, and provides technical assistance to neighborhood groups, local stakeholders, and institutions. We're also joined by Rahsaan Harris, who is the CEO of Citizens New York City, formerly Citizens Committee New York City, where I used to work, a nonprofit funded during the New York City fiscal crisis in the 1970s to help New Yorkers come together and improve the quality of life in their neighborhoods. Dr. Harris has more than 20 years of experience leading nonprofits in international grant making, partnering with communities to make local investments and promote community improvement. And flipping to the other coast, I would also like to introduce Mike Espinoza, where Mike is a lifelong community and political organizer, beginning his career with the SEIU, Union Houston Justice for Janitors campaign in 2006, and has been leading organizing campaigns throughout the Southwestern US, including the Fight for $15, Stand for Children, Industrial Areas Foundation, Leadership, Education Equity, and numerous political campaigns. Mike currently serves as the executive director of the Children's Movement of Fresno. So thank you all for being here with us today as part of this very important webinar, and I look forward to hearing more about you. And with that, I will now turn it over to Rianna, who will take us through the first part of looking at what's going on with Grassroots organization.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about the context of these studies. So these studies came to be because we'd seen growing interest in community engagement and power building by foundations and government agencies. But at times, as David said, grassroots organizations can be overlooked as vital to getting residents engaged and building community power. But we know that grassroots groups and the intermediary organizations that support them are a critical piece of the social safety net, and they could absolutely benefit from having greater foundation and government investment, especially in times of crisis. So at the time of these studies in 2021, organizations were still dealing with COVID-19 and issues related to the heightened awareness about systemic racism. But when we tried to look, we saw that there was little up-to-date information about how to strengthen grassroots leadership, as well as their capacity and their effectiveness. So we decided to learn more about the priorities of these organizations and to assess how to empower and sustain community efforts. And I'd just like to note that throughout this webinar, you may hear us say VGO or grassroots groups, which refers to the local associations and mutual aid groups that we have listed here. So for our first study, we focused on volunteer-led grassroots organizations, and we used an online survey that focused on ways to support them in responding to future public health and social justice issues, while also capturing what they were doing in 2020. We were able to get over 400 responses from organizations across the country. And as part of our sampling strategy, we targeted organizations in the top 30 metropolitan cities. And as you can see, more than half of that sample were from grassroots groups from those top 30 locations. Many of our respondents also represented neighborhood associations, and they worked primarily in white and middle-class communities. But we'd like to focus on a subset of our findings related to grassroots organizations serving low-income communities of color. And we're doing this because we were interested in taking a closer look at the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on low-income communities of color, as well as the importance of social justice concerns in these communities. This map shows the distribution of responses for participants who said their organizations served low-income communities of color. As you can see, the largest share of our participants came from the South. But overall, it was about 26% of grassroots groups from our survey who operated in predominantly low-income communities of color, which we were defining as organizations in neighborhoods that were primarily Black, Asian, Latino, or Hispanic, and also low-income or working class. And for our analysis, respondents who characterized their communities as low-income or working class were combined into a single lower-income category. Based on this, we were able to determine that 80% of grassroots organizations serving communities of color also said that their neighborhoods were predominantly lower income. So part of our survey asked participants if their organizations had done any work in response to the pandemic, as well as the social justice protests that were happening in the summer of 2020. We found that VGOs in low-income communities of color were much more likely to report doing something to address the impact of the pandemic happening in their communities compared to our overall survey sample. However, they were much less likely to report doing social justice organizing during this time. But it may come as no surprise that the pandemic seemed to be the dominating priority in 2020. And the charts that we're showing here show the top pandemic and social justice activities that were underway during 2020. On the left, you see that access to vaccination sites and emergency food or clothing were the top COVID-19 related issues addressed by VGOs, whereas on the right, community police relations and discrimination or racism were the most addressed social justice issues by these groups working in low-income communities of color. We also asked participants if they felt that their pandemic or social justice efforts had been effective. And when we took a closer look, we found that those who felt that their efforts had been successful were more likely to have nonprofit or 501c3 status. They were also more likely to say that the help that they needed during this time was easy to find. And when you think about this, to some extent, these two outcomes may feed into each other because grassroots groups with nonprofit status tend to be larger or at least have plans to grow. And with that mindset comes more organizational structure or formality that can aid in their effectiveness. And having nonprofit status can also open doors and provide easier access to resources and funding, especially in terms of grants that are reserved for those organizations that are already incorporated. And we found that these, having nonprofit status and saying it was easier to get help when needed was regardless of the type of activities that were underway in 2020. We also asked about the top capacity needs for organizations. And when exploring where grassroots groups preferred to go for support, we found that the majority of them reported going to other nonprofits or trying to find assistance from their local city hall. And when we asked them how they like to learn or get help, participants preferred to use online resources as well as going to in-person workshops or events. This slide shows the top 4 capacity needs that they reported, with nearly half of participants saying that their organizations would benefit from greater collaboration with other grassroots groups, as well as building capacity for community organizing. So now I'd like to take about 10 minutes to hear from our panelists. We have some questions here for our panel to consider. So it'd be great if you could choose one and share your thoughts with us, or feel free to respond with something else if there's anything important you think that we've missed here.
I could jump in.
Thank you, Ariana. We'll start with you.
Yeah, so these findings are awesome, and I really feel like it speaks to the work that Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center does in Indianapolis by working boots on the ground with neighborhood associations. Really, our bread and butter was for lack of better words, in our work is for neighbors. I mean, we work with stakeholders and other people who are assets as well, but mostly neighbors. So for number 2, I could say, how can these organizations address public health and social justice crises? From what I've seen in Indianapolis, neighbors are doing that by being, like it was mentioned earlier, the first responders, them living there and seeing what's happening. I have some notes here. They're giving first ground response. So when it comes to what I call state sanctioned violence or police violence, they know firstly what's going on and what the relationship is between police and certain individuals, or just whole blocks, or just their entire neighborhood. Food deserts, the correlation for the lack of food and police. And so I've seen these different neighborhood groups take it upon themselves to have their own food pantries, people having events where people can just come hang out on their porch and feed neighbors and talking. And this turns into a neighborhood association meeting or a way to engage with neighbors and bring them into neighborhood associations to where they can be at the decision-making table and, elevate the issues from their particular group to the city and to other organizations like myself. So Indianapolis neighborhoods are really doing these things.
I'll jump in. David and Rianna, thank you so much for this invitation. Citizens Committee for New York City was built on the premise that individuals can make a difference. And if you provide them with resources, they'll be able to improve the conditions in their neighborhoods. And they are folks that are truly on the ground and have knowledge to be able to make a difference because they have that on the ground experience. And so my reactions to the data are that it was so on point for what we do and really justifies the notion that supporting Block associations, supporting individuals that are coming together in the spaces where they live to improve their communities is an opportunity, number one, for leadership development, to get folks opportunities to step forward and to do more and to be part of the solution. And number two, as these leaders come together, you can address critical issues. You know, we've mentioned public health and social justice, but a plethora of issues if you aggregate all the actions of these folks together. So in order to be able to really catalyze that, I think, you know, capacity that's needed is really an opportunity for these individuals to get to know one another and come into spaces where they are seen as leaders, and folks provide them with resources to do more of what they've started to do. Starting people on their leadership journey is about validating them, giving access to new networks, because as they're in networks, they get access to more resources so they can potentially increase their impact and grow. And then secondly, I'm giving them an opportunity to really improve the way they communicate. So as you expand your networks, how you communicate with others, whether it's local elected officials, whether it's other grassroots organizations, other stakeholders where you can get resources from. There's a language, there's a way to be able to land what you're saying. And sometimes there's a learning of culture. So helping folks network and learn how to communicate effectively across different constituent groups, I think can continue to grow this work so that folks can continue to be more successful and grow.
Yeah, and want to echo my thanks to David and Rianna for this invitation. But the children's movement has adopted a very similar frame that Rahsaan and Ariana lifted up, in that you know, I think really diving deep into the community organizing, capacity building, and putting a finer point. I mean, a lot of the assumptions that residents will have when joining a community organizing group is, oh, we just get people together and, you know, let the magic happen. In reality, there's a deeper foundation of leadership development and framing around the ultimate goals and the clarity to say, we exist for this and this reason. And in our case, the children's movement and the Residents Council, which we've helped to bring about in Fresno County here in California, is aimed at, one, influencing the formation and passage of policies affecting childhood well-being in our county, and two, impacting and influencing the deployment of public funding around the issues that our residents care about most. Having that clarity is, you know, the first step in really is narrowing in, you know, to say, okay, what do we need in order to accomplish that? So when I saw the data around the capacity requests, or the capacity building that VGOs had listed up as their biggest questions, I mean, the continuously engaging, you know, being in continuous a relationship with the members in their networks. I mean, there are systems and tools and frames that exist that have been tried and true in the labor movement, in broad-based community organizing, that work. They absolutely work, and it becomes a craft and a skill and an art form that any leader can start to really adopt and utilize to build an organization. But having the clarity that, one, accomplishing those goals that we just talked about. In our case, it's influencing policy and influencing the deployment of public funds. You need power. At the very heart of building an organization like this is the ability to leverage power, to wield that power, and to utilize that power in order to control the terms by which we live our lives. And in our case, you know, as David knows from those of us who've been trained in a very specific brand of traditional community organizing, there are three types of power: organized money, which we know all about; organized, you know, positional power, with that folks in political office and institutional roles fill, and then the power of organized people, which is what we hope to leverage and wield as a community organizing group. Really honing in on those specific specific definitions, that language, that lexicon is really where we've had to invest a lot of time and energy locally.
Thank you all for your responses. We have time for one or two more questions. Are there any others there that you would like to respond to?
And if not, let me ask one of the question number 3, if somebody do that. I think one of the things that that we really haven't thought of, because it's such an untapped resource, what areas, what kind of ways can these VGOs be used that they're not being tapped in fully? How is citizen power not being used right now in ways that it could be used in these, needless to say, really incredibly challenging times, and a bit crazy as well? What can be done? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there's an opportunity to frame a conversation that these volunteer grassroots organizations are part of the solution, and having folks really being called to the table, as opposed to thinking that this is something that's out of their hands. You know, folks often are given the frame that, you know, the people who have the power will make the decisions. They don't necessarily feel as powerful. And that's what I think what we do at Citizens Committee resonates and is so important, is because it gets people on a little bit on their leadership journey from the very beginning. And so I think trying to take that to scale and making that more of a community narrative, that folks can be invited in to be part of the solution, that there are resources that are available to them, and that that funding is not only just available for the big winners, that you can, if you can tell the who, what, why, when, where, and how of what your idea is, that you can get funding, and breaking it down and getting assistance on a smaller level more accessible. I think that can be really important about giving folks a confidence, and that gives them continued reinforcement that they can do something and that they deserve a seat at the table.
Does anybody else want to respond quickly to that? It seems in these times of, like, you know, with overt racism and economic pressures and public health and natural disasters, what other opportunities does somebody want to?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in because Rahsaan, his comments definitely enlightened me a bit. It made me think of the artist community in Indianapolis that I come from, and luckily my experience in the artist community got me here. But a lot of artists are called in to create some sort of healing, some sort of something around any issue, whether it's bringing someone out to an event, and a memorial of some sort, but remembering something. But not often are artists called to ask about their experience as neighbors. A lot of these groups are volunteer-based groups that are people who just want to do something cool or whatever for their area, but, you know, have a light bulb of ideas together and want to bring, you know, those experiences. So I can think of so many amazing people in Indianapolis who are doing this work, but are only called in certain times and not necessarily passed the mic, I would say. And also viewing these people as neighbors, as your neighborhood association president, who can also paint an amazing mural and you know, organize people around that. And also the funding piece that Rahsaan had mentioned. Funding is available to a lot of people, but not a lot of people know. They think it's a bigger, larger institutional thing, or having a more polished resume, or you know, who you know. And something that INRC does is we work with neighborhood groups specifically and do different trainings and provide different grants, whether it's you know, a couple $100. I manage an arts grant program that's $5,000 per neighborhood group to do a mural. I also hope you don't hear squeaking. There's construction happening in front of my house, so I'm sorry about that. So I'll keep it brief, but I just think passing the mic to more different groups of people on the ground, as well as saying, hey, there's funding out there for you. You're not alone, because, you know, too often people are going to work and doing all of this on top of their everyday lives, as I guess we are as well.
Great, thank you. Mike, I wanted to see just if you have a quick comment there before I go.
No, I appreciate that frame from Ariana and Rahsaan's comments as well. I mean, that the idea is that if there is a vision for some sort of community transformation from grassroots to, you know, professionalized nonprofit, it really does come down to having that crystallizing idea and the will and the belief that you're not going to stop, right? In the union and SEIU and the janitors movement, we were constantly, told this is not possible. There's no way that you can build a union in the South, mostly immigrants that work at night, mostly women. It's impossible. Well, not buying into the hype that it is impossible was the first step, and recognizing that if we were to just get together and then see a movement through to victory, we can change the world, we can change the circumstances, and that is the kind of, we talk about that as militancy, but that commitment to a cause all the way to victory is the difference that grassroots leaders can bring to the table.
Great, thank you so much. And that's a perfect segue into the next part when we talk about how do we make that happen? How can we make 1,000 flowers bloom? How can we get that happening, that power, that potential to really begin to be available to everyone and every community and be able to take on the good fight. As Mike just mentioned, for the union labor movement to take on the impossible, they had to have a union providing support to the local chapters, providing the organizers. That was a key. It's not the front lines, it's not where the glory comes, but that support was really critical to those successes. And by reflection of your organizations, yourselves, this is what makes it all happen. Yes, it happens naturally, but so much more happens when they have that support. So the next part of our research is, and the study we're going to talk about are these organizations, which can be represented by those folks here, national organizations like the local initiative support corporations and NeighborWorks and other groups like that, mayor's offices around the country. There's a whole bunch of variety of support systems, loose, unconnected, and that was one of the reasons why we started this part of the study, is because, well, they're busy bringing everybody else together. Who brings them together? So we can move on to that part. We then took on a national intermediary study. And one of the things we want to mention, this is going on 2020 in the midst of all the craziness, the pandemic, and these are the people who are on the front lines, as we keep on saying. And so we really had much grander, old school views of how many people we can engage. We have lots of war stories about hackers and just trying to get people through. But I really appreciate that even though we set out for many more, we did get the time of these busy people, 28 responses and a few interviews to fill in of intermediary organizations. They were really focused locally in local organizations, not the national organizations. We got 50% of the sample from the top 30 metropolitan cities in the US. We did focus on those urban areas to make sure we got that view of it, but also did get rural areas as well. 64% identified as nonprofit organizations. Many of them, as we'll find out, were city hall or government's offices. That was probably singularly the most common form. And interestingly enough, if you have to go to the city that you're fighting, there's obviously some challenges there. But that was the most available resource in most of the cities. And most served lower income areas, but the primary race of the communities varied. So it was, again, like the earlier study, a little something for everybody. The distribution, very similar across the country. Various forms of that. Again, just representative who was able to find the time or succumb to our persistence to reserve. I don't think this is representative of the actual numbers, but it is representative of who we were able to survey. Now, what do they do? We've mentioned a few things here today, but the most common form of support was issue-specific workshops and webinars by nearly 2/3 of the groups that we interviewed. Leadership and organization as well, leadership and organizational development as well. Training on advocacy, community organizing, and coalition building was a major support offered by these intermediaries. And fundraising and proposal writing were among the top 4. And again, the larger study, which you'll get a much longer list with all the variations for each type of the groups that we've looked at. Again, the networking and fundraising opportunities that were offered by the intermediaries, 2/3 of them did peer learning or communities of practice, where they brought leaders together, linking function of linking grassroots leaders to larger institutions, government, business, foundations, convening for specific issues around coalition building, helping support development around coalitions around specific issues in their community. And I think one exciting part, most effective part, I know Citizens Committee has a lot to say about this, is small cedar incentive grants. Was under $2,000, that little bit, the $50, surely something I learned in my day there, how much a sign recognition, a sign and some bucks can do to really kind of reinforce and support these grassroots efforts. Now, just like the food they serve, they have their own needs, intermediaries, and the top three that were listed were additional funding for grants, to be able to distribute that money, because they also share that sense of power and influence of how do you re-grant, how do you trickle down to these grassroots groups in ways that they can do it, because not all of them are 501c3, not all tax exempt and well supported. So how do you get these small grants down, small C grants, small resources down to their level? And that's a main need to get more of those resources. This is something they're very good at, or I should say you folks are good at. Additional resources for convening nonprofits and grassroots groups to be able to bring people together with somewhat of the grass tops with the grassroots. And finally, additional staff capacity to be able to make those grant making opportunities, because that does take time, vetting. That is a labor intensive effort. Next, finally. So that was the overview. Okay, and that gets us going. And so now we're going back to our panelists, and the same as before. We have these questions that are in front of you, as well as any other questions or points you want to make about the intermediaries. And what's really the most interesting I'd like to hear is that what makes for success? What are the challenges? What makes for success in supporting these groups? What are those lessons you've learned? So any one of those questions, my questions?
Yeah, happy to jump in. There's a lot to share here when I say these questions and thinking about what the biggest tidbits. But I'm actually really thinking about Gianna Partit's question and the question and answer. I latched onto that because her question is, do you all think it's necessary for grassroots mutual aid community-based groups to transition in the nonprofit space? I think the reason why that caught my attention is that before my life as a community organizer, I was a sociologist training in social movement theory. And one of I'll refer you to, I talk about this for any of our sociologist wonks or social theory wonks out there. Suzanne Stagenborg talks about a really fascinating concept called formalization of social movement organizations, in that she talks about the drawbacks and the strengths to formalizing, meaning going into nonprofit space, becoming a different level of structure, adding a different level of structure, adding a different scale. So going from a hyperlocal to a national, all has, what she talked about is a little bit of the trade-offs that come with that, right? And there are real trade-offs and guidelines as you kind of integrate into from an informal network of residents trying to make a difference in the world to a large, or mid-sized budget organization. It's really taking on the added level of structure is incredibly, can be cumbersome, right? It can be encumbrous. Now that said, the ability to kind of expand and hire staff and to have a model that you want to engage in to do the work, and the tools at your disposal and the ability to sustain that through fundraising is what comes as the bone. Really, it does come down to your organization's ability to crystallize a goal, crystallize a method, crystallize a model, crystallize what it is you hope to achieve. And with that clarity, you can kind of steer and navigate the challenges of formalizing into a nonprofit. You can steer in the challenges from funders who want a specific thing of you and are asking you to do it a specific way. You can navigate that by having the clarity to say, this is what we want our change to be in the world. And you can gravitate investors and funders who align with that. So I think that's, as I'm reflecting on these questions and thinking about how you measure success, how you are able to navigate being, the grassroots organization or a mid or large nonprofit, is clarity first and foremost about your goals.
Who'd like to go next? What question would you like to answer?
I'll go forward. What are the most effective things that my organization does to improve the success and sustainability of grassroots organizations. I'll put it that we're stronger together. So us acting as a resource hub adds to the sustainability and the success of the grassroots organizations that are connected to us. Because when we connect them to the resources that they need, then they can add on the different components that make them more and more successful. One of the resources that's kind of obvious and came out in your data is if we had more grant funding to be able to re-grant and allow them to have some resources that help them to do their work and implement their projects, that's great. But another resource is connecting them to one another, connecting them to local elected officials, connecting them to leadership and development courses and techniques, and giving them a platform for visibility. I've seen the folks that have been able to grow well beyond where they met us accomplish that because of the visibility and the platform and the connections that they get through us as a resource hub. So I think it's really important to find intermediaries that are at the center of like information, contacts, and financial resources, so that the grassroots organizations that desire to grow bigger can. And for those that want to do it as volunteers, at least have some resource to get some of the finances that they need to do their projects on that smaller scale that sustain them. Because as Mike was saying, you can collapse under the weight of expectations of trying to formalize. So not all progress necessarily needs to be formalized, but by formalizing, then you can potentially attract more resources and sustain a movement and potentially a living if you're working in communities that way.
Great, thank you. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, wow, so much. I feel like I had my thoughts, and then as both Mike and Rahsaan were talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, so many things. So I'll just go off of number 2.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most effective things? I mentioned before, we work with neighborhood groups on doing different workshops, community building, literal like learning building blocks on how to be a neighborhood association, how to engage with community, literally appreciative inquiry and listening, like the way you ask questions to neighbors about ideas you have, making sure that you're not pushing ideas on them, but, you know, bringing the whole community in as a whole. Multiple of our workshops series, I think that we do that. That's one of the best things we do, I think. Not only holding the hands of neighbors and leading them through based on the different points that they're at, since everybody's at a different community organizing point and experience, as well as a lot of my role is just taking meetings with people, showing up to neighborhood meetings and just listening and hearing what neighbors are talking about, connecting with the mayor's neighborhood advocate in that area. In Indianapolis, we have different mayor's neighborhood advocates connected to the mayor's office that represent large parts of the city. So an M&A may have, 6 to 10 neighborhood associations that they're working with. And then I want to make sure that I'm connecting resources from the city, whether it's larger grants or, just help, volunteer resources, anything to really just make sure that these neighborhood groups, whether they're formalized into 501c3s or partnering with a local 501c3 institution like myself or others for extra support, just really making sure that they feel supported, I think is the biggest thing that we do. And the success really does come from how many people are showing up at their meetings, how many community events did they do, or did they just keep going? A lot of neighborhood associations are struggling to get people back into even attending the meetings. Food's not even helping, so, how do we pull people in? And so just being there to really support them, and then also being the hub, connecting all of the resources out in the city and then pushing that right back out.
Great. Thank you so much.
If I can add to that just really quickly, to try to get into what are some of the biggest challenges, because providing capacity building at scale is difficult. And so I think you need to utilize what you can through newsletters, through virtual meetings like Zooms like this, and record them so folks can go back to them, but then also be able to be responsive to emails and phone calls and some in-person gatherings. Doing a combination of the both, I think, will allow tools and resources to be available for folks over the long term that can pick it up on their own, and then also for folks to engage directly with staff. But thinking about how to go to scale, because capacity building and leadership development can be, almost a never ending and very long labor intensive process. But I think having an approach that makes it accessible to everyone to at least know where to start their journey and to point them to other spaces is critically important.
Thank you. Mike, do you have anything to add? We still have time.
Yeah, I was just giving some thought to the kind of the different brands of organizing between issue organizing and leadership development organizing. It's a spectrum between those two, right? It's not we just do this one or that one. I mean, but I will say that the strengths and the challenges and the drawbacks of each really depend, are defined by the clarity of what you want to achieve. If I am organizing a coalition, a grassroots coalition around immigrants' rights and achieving a specific policy win around immigrants' rights, I know I can tap different community groups that already exist. I can look at the Dreamers. I can recruit the Guatemalan, mutual aid societies, the Mexican mutual aid societies. I can also understand that the warp and wift and the strength and the opportunities that exist around that issue will govern the strength of my coalition. Mm-hmm. Now, another way to go, which is immeasurably harder, but one that will stand the test of time, is focusing on the leader themselves rather than the issue. Like you focus on recruiting the leaders, identifying and assembling a group of resident and grassroots leaders who then emerge and they agree to work together. And then the issues that you focus on emerge from that. Again, that is a much slower process. It is relationally based, and it will, but if you do it right, it'll stand the test of time. Whether there's opportunity, political opportunity, whether there's a policy opportunity, or whether there's repression, right? Whether there is a pushback, which, immigrants' rights is a good example of that. After 9/11, things changed dramatically for the immigrants' rights movement, and that had an impact on our issue organizing coalition, whereas the neighborhood organizations that were built around a broad-based diversity, multilingual leaders who were committed to working together for social change, that withstood the test of time. And still, many of those organizations are still in existence now, 20 years later.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. At the risk of running a little over, but I think this conversation led me to, now we've got you all warmed up on this stuff. Now I'm going to ask you the big question. So in these times, okay, where we have such racial and divisiveness, and especially because, as we've seen, diversity of groups that are engaged in dealing with social justice and public health issues, what do you see what have you tried? What do you see your role in bringing folks together around common issues across diverse interests, diverse racial backgrounds, different experiences? The majority of groups are white. Many white middle-class neighborhoods are out there. I live in Baltimore. We have civic associations that are in the middle and upper class communities, and we have civic and neighborhood associations in the lower income communities of color. Totally separate operations and separated. What do you see the potential of intermediaries addressing these racial divides and addressing the racism and other related phobias and fears? How's that for a quick question? Easy one.
Yeah, well, Rahsaan, do you want to go? I don't know.
Yeah, you can go first and then I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody's ready for this one, yeah.
Quickly. Just to say that is such a heavy question. The idea of we can accomplish everything. We can't fight everything at once. So I guess what I can say, a couple things. One, checking your privilege. Every individual in an institutional role, in roles like these and others, just seeing where you lie, where do you lie, I guess, in racial justice, social justice issues, as well as I feel like INRC, Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center's role is connecting across lines. And so I say that I mean that in many different ways. And so getting institutions to talk to neighbors, we are kind of that voice, but asking different institutions that pop up in areas that want to do neighborhood renewal, or, ooh, there's this multi-million-dollar apartments happening and they want to do some cleanups. Well, who's talked to the neighbors? Who's talked to people who have been there for generations? Who's sitting at their meetings, just having conversations, meeting them at their community McDonald's or wherever they go and meet? And as well as I think myself, when I say like I represent the Indianapolis, a part of the Indianapolis community, I don't represent the larger artist community, but people that look like me in positions like this, people that look like us, I guess I could say. I'm an artist, I have tattoos, I'm a homeowner, I'm an Indianapolis native, but I'm extremely passionate and extremely involved. And I guess for people one that don't look like me to see this, to experience this and experience the work that I do, but that my organization does, as well as people that look like me who never had any thoughts of that their neighborhood work is real work, is real. It's creative placemaking, it's neighborhood organization, it's community building, it's leadership. And so bringing all of these different pieces together to a place to speak, I think is what I feel like my role is in INRC.
Thank you. Son?
I just want to say it's so important for everyone to be at the table, and not our intentions for better communities, our intention for all of us to do well, matter a lot. You don't necessarily have to be a racial justice expert to be able to help create the environment where racial justice can happen and where reconciliation can happen. And we're only doing as well as, you know, the worst off of us are doing. And some of us are worse off because of systems that have held people back. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, checking privilege, is just recognizing that, you know, some of us are blessed to be where we are because of some of our hard work, but also where we've been situationally placed, and that we can do more to help others that might not have had some of the same opportunities. And we can also learn a lot by going to spaces where information is new to us and can teach us more. So looking to places where there might be problems and seeing people as assets as opposed to problems will allow us to move the work so much more forward. And Mike said before about some of the different coalitions and organizations that were multilingual and multi-issue, that they were able to persist. Just this understanding that intermediaries can be spaces where we support a diversity of folks that can persist to be able to step up to any challenge that comes ahead of us. And I think investing in this space can invest in leaders that can endure for a long time.
Great, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, to take off of that point, Rahsaan, I mean, as a direct point of investment is that I've had to invest a great deal of my time raising the funds to create a multilingual space by hiring an interpretation vendor for our Zoom gatherings, right? To make sure that, you know, we have interpretation in place for 5 different languages, which is what we speak in our residence council: Arabic, Hmong, Khmer, English, and Spanish. I mean, that it is not cheap to have a professional interpreter in those spaces, and it impacts your organizing timeline. I won't go into all that, but translating every document to make sure that it is accessible to every member of that community is a worthwhile investment and an intensive one. Now, that said, I think as the vast majority of our resident council are people of color, and I'm talking about 95% are people of color in our residence council, which is composed of 100 members, 100 people from across the county, you know, again, speak 5 languages, heavy skew towards Latino and immigrant families, and then other groups, right? So I think the dynamic where we've put our persistence and our resilience to the test has been in dialoguing with a group of, get this, school administrators, superintendents. There are 32 school districts in Fresno County. They have a group where all those superintendents meet on a regular basis to kind of solve some problems together, but they recognize we need to hear from the residents in order to kind of confront some of this, right? Overwhelmingly, you know, kind of the same way that we were overwhelming people of color, the superintendent's group is overwhelmingly white. So in understanding that this is a place where we could bridge a major institutional divide by bringing these folks into dialogue has been a challenge for many different reasons. But the one that I think I want to point to, kind of taking off of the checking your privilege, is the impetus to pace the work for privilege. Pacing for privilege is the immediate pushback that I get, where folks in that group of superintendents, they feel comfortable telling Mike, you know, we understand that, you know, you want to push hard, you know, but we got to take things slow. And from the beginning of social justice organizing and movement building in this country, there has been an impetus to say, let's go slower. Let's take this step by step. Our institutions don't change on the drop of a dime. Well, part of this work is saying, look, let's be conscious and check our privilege and say that folks who are organizing around issues and people in place they can't wait. There's no more time. They are living with their pain and anger on a daily basis. And if you want to be in relationship with them, you got to recognize that. And they do, by and large. They have had the experience of being yelled at in their school board meeting. But what we've done is create a different place for them to be in dialogue where, you know, look, we are not going to yell at you in a public forum. What we are going to do is ask about your budget. We're going to ask about how you're deploying those funds. We're going to ask about why this line item exists here and not there based on the priorities that you've kind of spelled out with your boards. Mm-hmm. We're going to ask those hard questions. And if you're really interested in doing this work together as a group of mostly white, very powerful institutional leaders, you'd be willing to dialogue about those things. So I would point back to the pacing for privilege as a major challenge.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And I knew this was going to get the juices going. We're going to move on. We'll leave some time for Q&A afterwards. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A tab. Go to the next slide. This is great. I just wanted to kind of sum it up here. What our recommendations in our report really looking to continue to develop and inventory the database of voluntary grassroots organization intermediaries. We just don't know what's out there. They're a tremendous resource. We went the equivalent of door to door. You know, do people have lists? And really, even the groups don't have that list. They always say, well, we haven't been able to update. We don't have a full list. So really, that inventory of this powerful force is a great resource. And if we're going to mobilize a nation, we're going to mobilize a city, we have the technology to be able to activate these groups if we begin to try. And I think that's important. We need to continue to conduct research. It's not on the front lines, but really the understanding of what's going on contributing to effectiveness. There's such a gap of 20 years where this has been overlooked in literature. It was one of our biggest challenges. But fortunately, there's more happening now than there was before. Be able to, you know, generate and compile resources that could be used for grassroots groups and public health organizations. How do they work together? That's going to be a theme coming up in the questions. How do you bridge these gaps? How do you get these formal institutions to work with these grassroots groups? We need to be able to develop that technology, those supports, those strategies, and share them with other intermediaries, which is why the fourth, and I think probably the most important one of these recommendations is to convene an active network or hub for intermediaries where these lessons can be shared on an ongoing basis. One more thing to do, I know, but really important to share what the lessons learned rather than in a 1-hour webinar every few years. And I think that that's really a critical part of it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dante, give him some moment of fame to go over some of those questions. One I'm going to just very quickly raise because it's come up in a couple places was around building relationships. You know, how does it, one question is about the volunteer-driven policy group. Another question we've gotten is around how does government agencies build relationships with grassroots groups? Who wants to take those on?
Just really quickly, I think it would be great to give the information of the services that are available, make them available for newsletters and communications. And so I think that's the way to engage them. You know, the volunteer, if I'm reading this right, the volunteer driven on issue areas, I think a lot of these volunteer groups would join in if they knew that some of these opportunities are available. So utilizing the communication mechanisms to get involved.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts on how does those in our audience who are either working for government or nonprofit, you know, higher grass tops type groups, what are their first steps?
I would jump in and say just connect with Mayor's Neighborhood Advocates. I feel like my staff is going to get tired of me saying it, but connecting just with the people already doing the work. I find in Indy that a lot of us sometimes want to reinvent the wheel. And so it's like, well, we all came together when it's like, we could have just gotten the same car because we're all doing the same work. So connecting, just even newsletters, or a lot of my work has come from Facebook and social media, and just seeing what events are happening. And it doesn't always have to be a formalized meeting or neighborhood meeting. It could just be some sort of social. And I find that those are sometimes easier to just connect.
Along those same lines, I mean, I tell this to the kind of the same way. I think that if my staff were on the call, they would be like, oh, here we go again. It's the one-on-one. As organizers, I mean, part of what makes a full-time job of organizing is not just organizing the place and buying the food and, making the calls or doing the Facebook, the social media posts. It is one-to-one meeting with people that you care about in your constituency. So what I've lifted up to them every time we've hit a challenge where I just don't know how we're going to get past this hurdle in this issue caucus that we've designed around mental health. We don't have agreement. My answer, I was like, what the answer is going to be? Yes, we got to do one-on-ones with each of the committee members. Yes, I mean, as an organizer, that is your one surefire way to, if you invest that level of time in connecting individually, to have a fulsome conversation. And get the things that people won't necessarily say in a community meeting or in a committee meeting or anything like that. And then helping that guide how you work together in your body. I guarantee you there's going to be a different level of results that can come from that. So I know it's not a sexy answer, but doing the one-to-one is a basic unit of a 30-minute meeting, one-to-one conversation with somebody to achieve a goal of working together in a social movement organization or in a committee. You can't beat that.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And I think the lesson I hear from that and from my own experience is that and I think a theme in the last few minutes has been, you're talking to another person. It's really building relationships. It's not that formal. There's not a model for it. There's not an acronym that we can use or a label we can put at. It's really that one-to-one, building relationships with people. So many times engagement is like your focus group, a town hall meeting, and you're just taking things one way. These are building reciprocal, even relationships. Easier said than done, but that's what a good relationship is. It works for everybody involved, and you need to first start asking what those things are. So I thank you all for that. Surely I could have gone on for a few more hours. I don't know about the rest of you, but this is really fascinating, especially as we get closer to some of these really hardcore issues that are facing these groups, facing our countries and these communities in these extremely difficult times. I wanted to thank our panelists, Ari and Mike and Rahsaan, for their time and efforts and thoughtfulness. It's been wonderful. I clearly want to thank Dante for being behind the scenes, making all this wonderful happens. And most of all, I want to thank Rianna Grissom, who's just been a driving force, and all the quality, all the good stuff that you see here. Just thank Rianna. I get to be the spokesmodel for this group, but I do not deserve the credit for it. And again, I want to thank everybody for their participation. We will be following up with the report, the presentation, resources that our panelists and others will share. And I hope that everybody stays. If you have any questions, of course, you can reach back to us at info@communityscience.com. And lastly, I hope everybody stays safe and well and loving. Everyone have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.